grateful believer in Jesus Christ. And I've struggled with a long list of things, as many of us have. I'm in recovery for drugs, alcohol, depression, grief, codependency, just to name a few. I want to start by giving you a short version of my background, just so you have a better idea of what God has delivered me from. My parents were a picture-perfect couple in middle school and high school. I heard a lot of people refer to them as Ken and Barbie. They partied quite a bit, and I came into the picture when they were 15. They got married at 18. I was a flower girl at their wedding. We lived with my grandparents until I was about 5 years old. When my parents got their own house, I honestly can say I don't remember a lot of my childhood. At my grandparents' house, things were loving and peaceful, but at home, it was full of anxiety, sadness, shame, depression, a lot of verbal, emotional, and physical abuse. We never went to church growing up. We didn't pray before meals, at night, or any time. I honestly had no idea who Jesus was as a child. If I had heard anything about him, I just put him in the same category as a fantasy movie I had seen. From the outside looking in, people still thought my parents were an amazing couple with great jobs and now 3 daughters. What they didn't see was all the fighting, the screaming at each other, all the time my sisters and I spent isolated in our room, the abuse, the trauma, nights and weekends left alone while they went out and partied and come home and fight some more. Sorry, this is a little emotional. One time when I had to call 911 because my parents had locked themselves in the basement and all I could hear was my mom screaming, my dad yelling, her being thrown into walls and glass crashing to the floor. By this time I was 17. I had a son of my own who was almost 3. His father wasn't in the picture anymore. Thank you. I had already experimented with alcohol, pills, marijuana, cocaine, meth, and obviously having a son, I had been sexually active already. And that started at the age of 13. I was trying to find my self-worth in guys, and I truly believed that if I gave them what they wanted, they would love me in return. I met a guy when I was 18. He said all the right things. He made me feel loved, or whatever I thought love was at the time. So I packed up my son and all of our stuff, and we moved in with him. The following year was 9/11. He was deployed in the Army. About a month after that, I found out I was pregnant. He was able to come home for a few months into my pregnancy, or after a few months into my pregnancy, and we got married. It just seemed like the right thing to do. To make a really long story short, that marriage ended in divorce after 6 years. He had cheated on me the entire time with countless women. He became abusive to me and my son. During our marriage, I became deeply depressed and actually attempted suicide twice. Those suicide attempts landed me in the psych ward, where I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, among other things, given a handful of medication that was supposed to make me feel better. After we divorced, I had a new sense of freedom. I guess you could say an entitlement, thinking I could do whatever I wanted now. I was 24, divorced, 2 children, and still God nowhere on my radar. But looking back, I can see where I was on his the entire time. In my newfound freedom, I decided to start drinking and partying a lot. I was still on a ton of psych medication, and I decided one night while drinking to add cocaine to the mix. I started out just doing it while drinking with other people and at parties. Then I didn't want to drink anymore, I just wanted the drugs. Then I didn't want to share anymore, so I started doing it by myself. I truly believe that my kids were perfectly fine during this time because I didn't do drugs in front of them. I drank in front of them, but I didn't consider that an issue. They had food, they had clothing, they had a roof over their head. I was home the majority of the time with them, and looking back, I was physically there, but emotionally, I was nowhere to be found. I met my second husband at 25. His name was Shannon. I wasn't looking for a relationship. That was the last thing on my mind, and I actually avoided him for quite some time. He was pretty persistent in trying to talk to me. When I finally talked to him, we just kind of clicked. I was still in the middle of my cocaine addiction, although it had slowed down quite a bit at that time. He had a pain pill addiction and drank quite a bit, but I didn't realize how severe it was at that time. We both drank together, occasionally did coke, while attempting to build a family life together, and neither one of us knew what a healthy, stable, or loving family looked like. About a year into our relationship, an acquaintance gave Shannon some meth. We did it together. That went on for a couple months off and on. And then the same person talked Shannon into buying pills at the pharmacy for him to make meth. Eventually he talked me into doing the same thing as well. One particular time, I went to the pharmacy to buy pills, and the pharmacist handed me my license back and said, "You've reached your maximum amount that you can buy this month. I can't sell these to you." That was probably one of the most embarrassing and lowest points in my life, as there was a long line of people behind me, and I could just tell by the pharmacist's face that he knew why I was buying them. I left there really upset, and honestly, I can't say if I was upset because I didn't get what I wanted, or that I was disappointed in myself for being in the middle of this. God totally intervened in that situation, because about 30 minutes later, we were supposed to meet this guy and give him the pills. And that's right when his house was raided and everybody there went to jail. We would have been right in the middle of that. The thought of that and knowing or not knowing where my children would be scared the life out of me. That was August 15th, 2009, the day I decided I had to make a change. Shannon wasn't as convinced that that was the beginning of the end, and he didn't get sober right away. It took him about another 6 months, and then he decided to give up everything. And I think that was more of, he didn't want to hear me complain about it anymore. He wasn't truly ready to give it up. About a month after that incident, I found out that I was pregnant, which was quite a shock because a few years prior, I had a tubal pregnancy and surgery to remove that and multiple cysts and to remove my left ovary. The doctors told me I had a 2% chance of ever getting pregnant, and to me, that meant never. Obviously, God had other plans. Around the time our daughter was born, Shannon was having a lot of lower back pain and went to the doctor to find out what was wrong. That's when we found out that his left kidney had shut down. He had a blockage and he needed surgery. He was prescribed a ton of pain medication, which started his pain pill addiction up again. He eventually stopped taking the pills on his own and was sober for a few months, only to have his kidney fail again. We went through the cycle for a few years, and he ended up having 5 separate surgeries during this time. And at one point, the doctors talked about a kidney transplant, and I was going to donate a kidney to him. During this time, we had another baby, So now there was 4 children in the middle of this. I also started getting curious about God at this time. I can't pinpoint a situation or a conversation or an event that happened that made me want to do this, but I knew I needed something more out of life. When I was trying to dig in to who God was, Shannon was still taking pills heavily, buying them from other people because his 30-day prescription would be gone in 2 days. He was buying pills anywhere from $4 to $8 a piece, and that really added up. I had money missing on a daily basis. He met a guy while trying to buy pills, and this guy told him that for $5 he could give him something way stronger that would last a lot longer. He decided to take this option to save money, and that's when his heroin addiction started. I didn't know right away that he was doing heroin. I just knew his addiction was steadily getting worse, and he refused to get help, and I suffered in silence for fear of judgment from friends and family. I eventually started attending and getting involved in drug awareness events in the community in hopes to help learn how to help my husband. I also helped organize all the Stop Heroin walks in Madison County. As Shannon kept falling deeper in his addiction, I started pulling farther away from him. I felt I could only have a normal life for myself and my kids without him. I made him move out the fall of 2014. I filed for divorce. I reconnected with a girlfriend from school at one of the Stop Heroin walks, and not long after that, we started the planning stages of recovery group. By Christmas 2014, Shannon had been calling me, promising me he was sober, begging to come home. I did talk to him a few times and met with him a couple times, and he seemed a lot different. He said he wanted to go to rehab, he wanted to go to church, he wanted to do things different this time. I gave in, I let him come home. Things were amazing. They were better than they ever were before. He even wanted to get involved with the recovery group and help other people. Sorry, guys. As we got closer to launching the group in March 2015, I noticed Shannon seemed a little off one day. He promised he hadn't done anything, and I wanted to believe him. Over the next few days, it became impossible to ignore the signs. He started a new job and worked overnight. I picked him up the next morning, and he couldn't hold his eyes open. Of course, he blamed it on being up all night, but I knew better. I begged him to be honest with me, and he swore over and over that he didn't take anything. I dropped him off so he could sleep it off before he had to work that night. He got out of the car and he said, "I love you." And I responded with, "If you love me, you wouldn't keep doing this." I drove myself and my kids to my sister's house. And as I was driving, I prayed for God to just make him go away, for him to leave us alone, so we didn't have to deal with this anymore. Sadly, that was the first and only time I had ever prayed for my husband. My oldest son was still home, and that evening he called me and said he couldn't wake Shannon up for work. My heart dropped. He said he was still breathing, he just wasn't responding to anything. I knew he had an overdose. On the way home, I called 911. I met the ambulance in my driveway. I told them that he had an overdose and I was positive he was taking heroin. They gave him a shot of Narcan. He woke up immediately. He stood up, he walked around a little bit, but he had no idea what was going on, and he couldn't form words. The paramedics were all very positive. They said, he's going to be fine, let's get to the hospital. They put him on the stretcher and into the ambulance, and I got in my car to follow. I remember thinking they were taking forever to leave. They finally flipped on the lights and the sirens and took off. As I followed, I made a phone call to get Shannon into an inpatient rehab because I knew he couldn't come home like that. My friend confirmed that there was a bed open for him. I got to the hospital and they wouldn't let me back right away. They said they had to do some tests. I sat in the waiting room for the longest 10 minutes of my life. Plus I was wearing a neon pink hoodie with huge black letters that said "Stop Heroin." I was a walking anti-drug billboard. The nurse finally took me back, and as I rounded the corner to the nurse's station, every nurse and doctor was standing there staring at me. I knew at this point there was something really wrong. The nurse guided me into an empty room. She said the doctor wanted to talk to me. The doctor came in and said, "I'm so sorry to have to tell you this, but your husband didn't make it." I was in shock. I said he was just walking around my living room. They said he was going to be fine. The doctor went on to tell me that Shannon had a massive heart attack in the ambulance and couldn't be revived. He was gone before they left the driveway. All I could think about was, how was I going to explain this to my kids? I had a tremendous amount of guilt for leaving him home and not driving him to the ER, not calling 911. And then I remembered my prayer after I dropped him off and thinking, that's not at all what I meant, God. Things were a huge blur for a while. I was pretty much on autopilot for months. I had to be strong for the kids. The kids obviously didn't take it well. They were 2, 4, 12, and 17 at the time. My 2-year-old Carson would say things like, "Can we just drive to heaven and pick Daddy up now? How's Daddy going to sleep in heaven without his pillow? Can I just call Daddy so he can come home?" All questions I was not prepared for, yet those were the questions that catapulted me into my relationship with God. Not only did I not know the answers to these questions, I couldn't wholeheartedly say that he was even in heaven. So I needed answers for myself that only God could answer. I continued with the recovery group with my friend. It started up exactly a week from Shannon's funeral. I made it my mission to help as many people as I could find recovery. Shannon's youngest brother reached out to me a couple weeks after the funeral, and he told me he had been doing heroin also. He said that I was the first person he told. He begged me to help him, and he said he didn't want to die. I found a treatment center for him, and he backed out at the last minute. Later, I set up an intervention for him with a good friend of mine and his whole family there to support him. He went to rehab the next day, and less than 24 hours later, he left. 6 months after Shannon overdosed, his brother overdosed and lost his life as well. I was full of regret and guilt all over again. I had a billion chances to share the love of Jesus with him, but I was so new in my faith that I wasn't confident enough to speak up for fear of rejection, as if the gospel was about me. That's the reason I never ignore those gentle nudges from the Holy Spirit to share my faith, and the reason I have hope today. My friend and I decided to take a break from the recovery group in November of 2015, and that's when I came to Abundant Life. I dove further and further into my relationship with Jesus, trying to find out who he was and why I needed him in my life so badly. I can attribute a great part of my healing and deep understanding of God to the people in our church that surrounded me with the love of Jesus and countless prayers. I was a complete wreck before God. I was a sinner in need of a Savior. Even though I was sober and trying to live a good life, I still had an emptiness that only God could fill. Little by little, I began to get involved in church. I could feel God calling me to get more uncomfortable and actually open my mouth and speak to people. My two youngest at the time, Jordan and Carson, they were also terrified of people. I feel like my anxiety consumed them at times as well. I got involved with the children's ministry to help them feel more comfortable in the kids' classes so they would get involved. They hated being away from me. They had severe separation anxiety. There were a few times I even left them in class crying. I knew they were in good hands, and I also knew that that was the start of them healing and overcoming the separation anxiety. It was a slow process, but I knew it was the only way. Today, they will go just about anywhere without me. They actually talk to people most of the time. And more importantly, they love Jesus, and they will share that with anyone. Many generational curses have been broken over my family and my children during this transition, and that overwhelms me with joy.
Hallelujah.
About a year after Shannon's death, I listened to a sermon about praying for your future husband and building him up before you find him. I hadn't been looking for anyone. I was still in the middle of my grief, but I couldn't get this sermon out of my head. So one night I typed up a prayer for my future husband. I really thought it was silly at the time. Not long after that, I got a Facebook friend request from someone that I had gone to school with from kindergarten through high school. He messaged me immediately afterwards. The message said something like, "I'm sorry to hear that you lost your husband. I lost my cousin to heroin also. I'm here if you ever need to talk." We started talking, and we soon realized that I had gone to his cousin's stop heroin walk the previous summer, and I had no idea they were even related. We talked nearly every day after that, and we had some deep spiritual conversations. I was praying more than I had ever prayed in my entire life, and gaining a deeper understanding of God and how much he truly loved me. That man's name was Joe. He's my husband now. We've been together 2.5 years and married 1.5 years. I never knew happiness like this existed. I truly met and married the man of my dreams. None of that would have been possible without God in the center and as our foundation. He fell in love with my kids, and they love him right back. We're even adopting my 3-year-old niece now as a result of my sister's addiction. He supports me in ways I can't even explain. He has been right by my side through some extreme hard times, including my mother's unexpected death a year ago. He's my constant encouragement and truly makes me feel like a princess even on my worst days. Plus, he didn't run away when I recruited him to start up a Celebrate Recovery group with some other awesome people. We're both extremely cautious with our words towards each other. He's had a previous marriage that was far from great. And I know what it feels like to regret your last words to someone. God gave me the scripture at the beginning of our relationship that we constantly refer to. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love, Ephesians 4:2. It truly is by the grace of God and God alone that I'm still here. And because of that, I have dedicated my entire life to following him, and I try my best to be obedient in every way. It's because of my relationship with God and the Celebrate Recovery group that I have learned how to not only forgive others who have hurt me, but to admit my wrongs to God, to others, and ask for forgiveness from both. I have learned how to accept forgiveness, and when that condemning voice of the enemy tries to bring up what I've done in the past, I can confidently say, yeah, I know, but I'm forgiven. I want to end with this. Let us not become weary of doing good, for at the proper time you will reap a harvest if you do not give up. Never, ever give up. Recovery is possible, true happiness is possible, and all things are possible with God. Thank you.
I look at Jana and Joe